Oi, estamos ao vivo? Voltamos, né? Então, boa tarde a todos e todas que estão aqui no auditório, que estão aqui no YouTube. Como eu falei anteriormente, eu sou a professora Ana Lacerda, coordenadora PB junto ao professor Maria Lúcia Gustavo de Simas. Nós vamos ter agora a nossa próxima palestra. Na verdade, essa palestra, do professor Frank, é a última palestra do dia. A próxima, professor que Brian, ele vai fazer a fala dele, obrigada, Matheus, vai fazer a fala dele na sexta-feira, tá? Então, essa é a nossa última palestra de hoje. Então, eu queria só deixar um recado para quem está assistindo online, para ficar atento ao e-mail, porque nós vamos ficar mandando o link, esse link vai mudar de vez em quando, então nós vamos ficar mandando o link pelo e-mail. Então, fiquem atentos ao e-mail da executiva produtora, tá? Que quem está organizando esse evento com a gente. Amanhã nós retomaremos às 9 horas com a palestra do professor Nelson Turmo, será presencial, o Nelson está aqui, vai estar aqui no auditório. Depois vai seguir com a minha palestra, tá? Sobre construção do teste de identidade de face, pessoas com esquizofrenia. Teremos uma pequena pausa para um coffee break de manhã, seguida da fala da professora Melissa Ariane, que também vai estar aqui, a Melissa vai estar aqui no auditório, para falar sobre a TCC aplicada a delírios, alucinações, algumas atualizações. Seguida do professor Rafael Massuda, a palestra do professor Rafael Massuda vai ser remota, tá? Ele não estará aqui no auditório. Temos a pausa para o almoço, e à tarde, às 14 horas, temos o Henrique Landim, que vai falar um pouco sobre os CAPs, né, os SUS, os CAPs, essa rede de atenção psicossocial com cuidado territorial a pessoas em sofrimento psíquico, seguido da fala da Thaís Macambira, que vai falar um pouquinho sobre a experiência dela no Hospital Luiz Fernando. Teremos, então, um coffee break no meio da tarde, a palestra do Henrique e da Thaís, eles estavam aqui no auditório também. Amanhã vai ser um dia bem presencial. Quem tiver hoje aí online por conta das chuvas e quiser vir amanhã para cá, para a gente conversar melhor, né? Vai ser bem interessante. E o nosso coffee break também puxando aqui. Depois da tarde, a gente tem, no final da tarde, já a palestra da Justiça Regular, psiquiatra, vai falar sobre atendimento do setor público e privado ao paciente com transtornos psiquiátricos. Ela vai estar aqui no YouTube também. E a última palestra da Alessandra Menieri, vai ser remota, ela está de fora, sobre as contribuições do neuropsicólogo no processo de avaliação diagnóstica do sistema privado. Então, só temos 2 palestras que serão remotas, pessoas que estão no auditório. As demais pessoas vão ser presencial, estão aqui no auditório, né? E para quem realmente não conseguir vir, assistir pelo YouTube, só fica realmente atento ao e-mail, que nós vamos enviar o link pelo e-mail, tá? Mas desde já, eu sugiro que venham por aqui. Então, vou passar a palavra para a Amanda, agora, tá? Que vai coordenar aqui a palestra do professor Frank.
Boa tarde, bem-vindos à nossa última palestra. E agora a gente vai ter o último momento com o professor Frank Larøi, que ele vai apresentar sobre Using 360 Degrees Immersive Use in Psychopathology Research. E ele é pesquisador e psicólogo clínico, trabalha no Departamento de Psicologia da Universidade de Liège, na Bélgica, e na Universidade de Oslo, na Noruega. Os interesses de pesquisa incluem psicose, detecção precoce da psicose e alucinações. Ele também propõe consultas clínicas para pacientes com alucinações e delírios persistentes na Clínica Universidade de Psicologia e Fonoaudiologia da clínica, gente, em francês, tá? Aí fica difícil de ler. Mas, provavelmente na Bélgica. Então, né, boas-vindas. It's a pleasure having you here. Make yourself home.
Professor? Microphone. Take out. Yes.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. Umbrella to the organization of the conference, to be able to also to be able to talk about others. I'll be presenting a few studies that we did a few years ago at the University of Liège, looking at 360-degree immersive video. So it's something similar to VR, like GPU, presented just before me. This was a little bit difficult expected to this technology. Let's see if the first one is on the screen. Should I press something? So I'll be looking at three examples, three studies looking at 360 immersive videos in psychopathology research. And these are the three studies. And hopefully I'll have time to present all three of them. If I don't have the references, then let's see if it's there. Okay, those are the three studies that we're talking about in that order. The first one is the validation of these immersive videos. It was the first time this actually had been done in literature. The second one is looking at can immersive videos change the empathy we have towards people who experience cultural hallucinations. The third study is we created an immersive video where it was able to detect different types of symptoms, paranoid thoughts, negative autonomic thoughts, and create it in the same immersive video. I'll start with the first one. And that was a study where we wanted to validate for the very first time immersive videos in the literature. It was published in 2021.
I saw it.
So that's the first study. It was just to validate. The immersive videos was tested 3 different videos to assess paranoia in a non-clinical population. So all 3 studies are presented are basically with immersive students in non-clinical populations, not with people with a diagnosis, to test the validity of these immersive videos. So one of the 360-degree immersive videos were accessible to experiences.
Ele tem que aproximar mais um pouco.
Virtual headsets. So virtual headsets are wonderful technology that I presented just before me. It's quite expensive, it's quite time consuming. This technology is very easy. Just take a camera and you film a situation such as this situation here in 360 degrees. So individuals are exposed to complex social situations, and importantly, people with real facial and body expressions, so it's as real life as possible. Whereas virtual reality sometimes is difficult to talk about. So this very first study, our aim was for the first time to develop and validate 3 immersive videos for the assessment of state paranoia in a non-clinical sample. So we tested 2 levels of validity for each 360-degree immersive video. The first one is specific to paranoia, so to examine the capacity to elicit paranoid thoughts that reflect individual tendencies towards trait paranoia. First hypothesis for this study was that participants would report various paranoid ideations, so paranoid thoughts when they're exposed to it. But they would also report positive and neutral ideations when they were exposed in the immersive video. The second hypothesis, or hype 2, there would be a skewed distribution of paranoid thoughts in line with what the literature shows. So that is that very few people would actually have paranoid thoughts when they're exposed to videos, and the large majority won't have paranoid ideations. Hype 3, hypothesis 3, that there will be a positive, significant correlation between states and trait paranoia. So state paranoia was the form of paranoia during the immersive videos. Trait paranoia was measured with validated measures of trait paranoia. So that's the first level, specific to paranoia. And then, because it's one of the first studies in literature to look at immersive videos, we wanted to validate it on the second level, which is specific only to the immersive properties of these immersive videos. That is, what is the degree of sense of presence? When we ask people, how was it in the immersive video? Was it in real life? We want to see to what degree there was a high level, a low level of sense of presence. And the second thing with virtual reality and these types of technology, it can elicit or create cyber sickness, so nausea and random. So let's see, does this create a high degree of sickness? And then at the very bottom is we want to compare the 3 different immersive videos between them to see which one assess clinical evaluation best. So the 3 videos, the 3 immersive videos are to the left and lift. So we placed a 360-degree camera in the lift and filmed during a few minutes being actually in the lift, in the elevator. The second is in the example of the library. So we filmed in a library situation with various actors for the 3 to 4 minutes in the library situation. And the third immersive video was in a bar, where we did the same thing, filming with the camera 360 degrees. So these videos, the 3 videos, lift, library, and cafe, were created to reproduce daily life situations which were typical for the young people. We wanted to reproduce typical, static, social, daily life situations that vary in terms of crowd density. So the lift, there's only 2 or 3 other people in the lift, whereas on the other extreme, at the cafe, there are several people in the immersive environment. So will vary in terms of crowd density, space, sounds. There will be silence in some of them, there will be whispers, or booming. And all actors, well, they're not really actors, they're just friends of the researchers who range from 27 to 47 years old. We're instructed to behave as they would in similar situations, just discussing, moving around, occasionally to interact with the camera so that there are gazes or smiles towards the camera. Each immersive video lasts 3 minutes, so the lift, the library, and the cafe lasts 3 minutes. And it was filmed with a Nikon zoom machine 360 camera, just for So the procedure was quite simple. So the participants were assigned to one of the 3 video conditions. Here's the procedure. This was assigned to one of the 3 videos, either randomly to lift, library, or there were 2 phases for the emotion. First, there was an habituation phase, where the people were exposed in the video. There were no actors, they were just asked to move their heads and feel comfortable with headsets, but used to the situation. And then phase 2 was the actual immersion for 3 minutes in each of the 3. The instructions for all 3 were just please pay attention to people around you, try to get an impression of what you think about them, in addition to what they may think about you. And participants were asked whether they had recognized either the environment or the actors. The yes response would have led to exclusion from the study. So participants were then divided into 3 equivalent groups based on their age, level of education, and gender, to make sure the 3 groups were not different in terms of their age, in terms of level of education, in terms of gender, which is shown here in the table, detailed in the table. So just if you can see it, there were no differences between 3 groups. So in lift group, library group, bar group, there were no significant differences in terms of age. You can see between 3 groups, all 3 groups have 15 participants. results showed that, and I'll just repeat the slide I showed you during the introduction. Right, so the first hypothesis, if you recall the introduction, was that participants would report various types of thoughts, both paranoid thoughts, but also positive, neutral thoughts or ideations during the 3 minutes that they were exposed. Regarding that hypothesis, the results did indeed show us that participants reported both positive, neutral, and paranoid interpretations of the actors during the immersion. So they would show the various feelings, both negative feelings such as fear, anxiety during the immersion. They would elicit anger for certain participants, they would elicit confidence, curiosity, etc. And these were quite well constructed and sometimes opposed, whereas they would interpret actors' intentions with exclusion, intimidation, inclusion, exclusion. For example, I felt that the actors were excluding my work, and the opposite. I felt that they were actually including me as a friend. This very busy table that we're coming down just shows some examples of these various ideations or thoughts during the immersion. Just a few examples. During the lift, there was one participant mentioned I had the impression of being inferior to the person, to the actors. He was picking a fight with me. I had the impression that it was either ill-intentioned or trying to make me feel uncomfortable. So those are sort of paranoid-like interpretations during the 3 minutes. And remember, these videos were neutral, but the actors were asked just to neutral behaviors during the videos. And then at the bottom, you see the examples of positive and neutral interpretations. For example, it was just human beings with behaviors. There was a girl, she smiled at me. It was interrogative, it was also something. So a wide variety of thoughts were elicited during the 3 minutes. It could be paranoid type thoughts, but also very positive and neutral types of thoughts. In terms of the second hypothesis, which, as if you recall, was this one, there would be a skewed distribution of these paranoid thoughts in line with the literature, and that was what we found. The results showed the following: that the 3 distributions for the lift, the library, and the bar was significantly and positively skewed in the sense that for most participants in the study, they did not have any paranoid thoughts, while a few participants had many. So the large majority did not have any paranoid ideations, had neutral or positive types of ideations, whereas there was a small minority of participants across the 3 videos that had paranoid ideations. And then the third hypothesis, which we found there, if you recall, was that there would be a positive correlation between state and trait paranoia. So we measured state paranoia in the actual immersions themselves. And trait paranoia was measured with validated questionnaires. And the results for that was indeed that there were positive significant correlations. So there was various correlations between state and trait paranoia in all the participants across the 3 videos. Showed that for the lift, there was a significant moderate positive correlation, that is, for people who had the state paranoia during the lift in the video immersion. This was correlated positively and significantly with trait paranoia using validated questionnaires. The second immersive video in the library, there was also significant moderate positive correlation, that is, people, the participants during that immersion, was a positive correlation between experiencing paranoid ideation and also reporting that validated measure of trait paranoia. But for the third immersive video, the bar, there were no significant correlations between state and trait paranoia. Then over to the second level, which was validating this on a very general level in terms of the technology. Is there a certain degree of sense of presence when people are immersed in these immersive videos? Yes or no? the short answer is yes, there was a relatively high sense of physical space. So 80% of participants in the lift in the library reported sensations of sharing the same space as the characters and or objects, and that the characters were aware of them. And then 40% of participants from the lift in the library, only 12% from the bar, reported the sensation that parts of the displayed environment were responding to, despite the infinite degree of immersive videos being unresponsive. That is, the way the person, the participant, reacted did not influence how the actors in the immersive videos reacted. So they did have this subjective experience of this. And the ITQ score was at the end. There was just the level of immersive tendency, and the highest score was the library video. The lift was number 2, and the lowest score in terms of immersive tendency was the video. And then the final hypothesis was, is there a certain degree of sleep sickness when people are exposed in these immersive videos for 3 minutes? The short answer to that question is that no. There was a low level of cyber sickness. The results revealed that 3 videos did not have a negative effect for most participants. 90% of participants had any sensations of nausea. Over 80% did not feel having a headache, and over 60% did not feel any eye strain. And then perhaps the most important thing is that we were interested in looking at, of these 3 videos, Lift, the library and cafe, which is the best video in terms of looking at the level of state paranoia. And the answer to that is the Lift and library, the 2 best videos. The Lift and library are most valid for the assessment of paranoia and non-cognitive samples. First of all, the Lift and library was a significantly higher state paranoia scores, and there were significantly lower neutral ideation scores compared to the bar. Second argument for that Lift and library best videos was that there was significant positive correlations, if you recall, between trait paranoia and state paranoia, but not for the bar. And then for the Lift and library, there was the sense of presence was higher compared to the bar. So all of these arguments conclude that probably in future studies, if people are interested in using this video, that the Lift and library would be the most valid and probably the best type of video most able to use. Now, what is the possible explanation of these differences? That the Lift and library is probably best. Well, what we explained in the article is that participants' visual access to interactions such as gazes, smiles, body expressions was more often in the Lift and the library. So the 2 immersive videos to the left. The Lift and the library, that people were more, had more access to gazes and body expressions. The Lift and library had smaller areas than the bar. The Lift clearly had smaller signal. The Lift had the highest number of interactions, 22 and 23, compared to the library. Not more interactions in the library, so the participants had access to interactions more often than in the Lift. And there was a higher probability, there probably was a higher probability to see these interactions in the Lift and the library. And this probably led to a higher probability of activating pre-existing paranoid schemas in participants with high levels of trait paranoia in these 2 immersive videos. So again, the 2 at the left, the Lift and the library. So future uses of the immersive video technology, and this was part of the PhD project that the pandemic we weren't able to do it. The idea was to examine the effects of substances. So once we validated these videos, and probably using the Lift and library, the videos to use in the future, we could examine the effects of substances such as alcohol, cannabis, caffeine, etc., on paranoid ideation, whatever type of trait, before versus after being immersed. So you can have people being immersed in the immersive video beforehand and give them one of these substances and see if this substance change increased the paranoid ideation. Yes. So that was the first study to validate, and specifically in terms of paranoid ideation. The second study, which I'm going to talk about, is on the societal level. So I did a lot of research looking at theoretical models, clinical models, various mechanisms involved in schizophrenia and psychosis, but also few looking at the societal level. This is very little research, unfortunately, is done on this level. So specifically, this is the study looking at the societal level, where we were interested in looking at can these immersive videos impact the level of empathy we have for people who actually experience auditory verbal hallucinations. So we used the one immersive video for this. And this is basically comparing third-person experience of auditory verbal hallucinations. So just having somebody describe what it's like having auditory verbal hallucinations, AVH, versus the first-person experience, so actually experiencing auditory verbal hallucinations using the 360-degree immersive videos. So putting on these goggles, being immersed in an immersive video, where it tries to simulate as much as possible the experience of having auditory verbal hallucinations. And the question we asked is, does this have an effect? Does this first-person experience have an effect on increasing empathy? Does it decrease social distance relating to these experiences? And does it reduce negative stereotypes in terms of people with psychosis, specifically with auditory verbal hallucinations? And the immersive video we chose, it's a new video, it's the same context was the cafe video. So we created a completely new video for this study in the cafe situation, which you see at the right there. The link to the left is you can actually see this immersive video. It's available on YouTube. You can click on that link and you have access to the immersive video. So this situation is the person is sitting in glass, so we have a camera on the table in the middle of a cafe, filmed 360 degrees for 3-4 minutes, where the person is watching people coming in and out of the cafe, passing in front, whilst listening to a soundtrack of voices. So we create a soundtrack of voices, so visually, the person with the goggles on is seeing the cafe situation 360 degrees, and at the same time is hearing a soundtrack which is trying to simulate the experience of auditory verbal hallucinations. So these were validated by two experts of experience, so two people with auditory verbal hallucinations validated this soundtrack. So it was as close as possible to the actual experience, where there was sometimes a masculine voice which would pop up, sometimes it would be a feminine voice would pop up, sometimes these voices would be front left in the auditive sphere, sometimes they would be in the back right, sometimes they were whispering, sometimes they were shouting, and they would have varying emotional and thematic contents. We spent a lot of time making sure this is real life, if you will, as possible. So they're in the cafe, and at the same time they're hearing these voices that are feminine, masculine, shouting, whispering, and different acoustic areas. So when we looked at the literature of what's called simulation interventions, so simulation interventions is, can we increase empathy, reduce stereotypes by simulating the experiences such as auditory verbal hallucinations via some sort of technology, such as videos? There were mixed results. So previous studies showed mixed results. Those studies using similar technology were only using virtual reality. One of the studies at that time had been using 360-degree immersive videos. They've been using only virtual VR studies, virtual reality. They found that it does indeed improve empathy. So using virtual reality that simulates auditory verbal hallucinations does increase empathy towards people who have these sorts of experiences. But unfortunately, it might potentially elicit a desire for social distance. So using VR technology that simulates auditory verbal hallucinations, the two studies that look at this, they actually increased social distance relating to people who have these experiences. So we were very conscious about those types of results. So we added into our design a specific condition looking at empathy, which is there. So we had three conditions. Control condition, where nothing happened. The second condition was 360-degree immersive video simulation of the cafe with the simulation of portrait stations. And then there was the third condition where they were sitting in the immersive video plus an empathy task, where we told people, take a minute to imagine and write about how a person suffering from schizophrenia feels when they go into a bar and hear voices or see things that others cannot see. So there were three groups, three conditions, around 40 people in each of the conditions, no differences in terms of age, gender, etc. This is the procedure, so people were randomly or pseudo-randomly assigned to either control situation condition or the 360-degree only condition or 360-degree and task condition. There were a few pre-test questionnaires that they filled out. All three groups were asked, were exposed to an auditory hallucination description, just describing what it's like to have auditory hallucinations. If you see at the right there's an empathetic task was put in the third group. So we wanted to see if having exposed people in these different immersive conditions reduced empathy, etc. Results, I'll just briefly present the results, showed that there was an increase in empathy. So being exposed in these immersive videos increased empathy towards people who have psychosis and who experience auditory hallucinations. There was no change, did not change the degree of social distance that people feel related to people with schizophrenia with auditory hallucinations, and had actually a negative effect on stereotypes. So actually increased, unfortunately, the effect of stereotypes after having been exposed in videos. The implications of this, there are several implications. The first one is that simulated immersions, such as using immersive videos or virtual reality, should probably be integrated with other interventions. So we should be using simulated interventions, but not alone. It should be included. We should also include information, eventually contact testimonials, not just simulated immersions. We need to better understand the processes underlying empathy, especially social distance and stereotypes, because as you recall, there was no difference in terms of social distance, but there was a deleterious effect on stereotypes. The hypothesis of the literature based on the studies was that by eliciting empathy, changing empathy, improving empathy, this will also automatically, to a certain extent, reduce stigma, but there might not be a simple thing to solve. And it might also be related to the results, might be related to the stereotype measure. The questionnaire we used to measure stereotypes, they had a very weak internal consistency both for the pre and post tests, so that might be related to the reason why we didn't find positive results from the stereotype measure. So that was the second study looking at societal aspects. Can we reduce empathy, this type of technology? The third, if I have the time, is the actually opposite of the first study, where we created an immersive video and asked the question, can this immersive video in non-clinical subjects elicit various types of symptoms? Can it elicit fear of negative motivation? Can it elicit paranoid thoughts like the first study? Can it elicit negative automatic thoughts? And can it elicit craving for cigarettes and for alcohol? So we created one immersive video to answer this question. And this was, again, for the first time in the literature, we designed and developed an immersive video capable of eliciting various psychological symptoms. So there were a few previous studies using 360-degree immersive videos. The one for paranoid thoughts was the very first study presented to me. That was the first one that showed that it does indeed, it can indeed elicit paranoid thoughts in non-clinical participants. There was one previous study where they were able to show that immersive videos can elicit fear of negative evaluation, which is fear related to social anxiety. And we wanted to ask the question, can one immersive video elicit both negative automatic thoughts, craving for alcohol, craving and craving for nicotine, in addition to common thoughts and fear of negative evaluation? And again, we also wanted to examine the degree of cyber sickness and sense of presence. In this third study, we looked at 4 dimensions. So we looked at a little bit more sophisticated manner of sense of presence once in members. And again, this was the cafe situation we chose because it was the most complex. We created a completely new video again with new actors. It was 2.5 minutes in this cafe situation. And we asked actors now to trigger. So in the previous two, in the first study, we didn't ask actors to trigger anything. We just wanted them to act completely natural in a cafe situation or a language situation, This time, we actually played the role of the director, if you will, in the film. We said, can you please try to trigger specific symptoms in the cafe? We made sure that the sound was not modified, so that it resembled an audible brouhaha, so we're able to actually hear what's being said. When we visit again. Right, as in the since we have a bit of experience, we changed the 2 phases. So the habituation phase, if you recall from the first stage, just simply put the goggles on, get used to the immersive environment without the actors, and then we put them in the immersive phase afterwards. This time we constructed the habituation phase, which was simply putting on the goggles, being in a calm place, and getting used to the 360-degree situation. And then the second phase was the actual 360-degree immersion in the cafe. There were 158 participants from the general population, so the population, aged on average 30 years, between 18 and 50 years old. The procedure was first an online phase where the participants filled out certain questionnaires, and then the second phase was a face-to-face meeting where they were run through the familiarization of emotion and the actual emotion itself, and then post-emotion assessment. Results. During the immersion, so during the immersion, participants reported various levels of all 5 different types of thoughts, if you will. Fear of negative evaluation, when they were exposed during the 2 minutes. They were also eliciting paranoid thoughts during this immersive video of 2.5 minutes. They also showed evidence of negative automatic thoughts, the craving for alcohol, and craving for nicotine. And then we were interested in the first study, is there a correlation between state measures, so what happens during the immersive video, and trait measures? And if you see the parallel we have here is that fear of negative evaluation, which was a state evaluation during the immersive video, was correlated with social anxiety. So having these types of negative evaluation is related to social anxiety. And indeed, we found positive correlations between state and trait aspects. The same thing, which was exactly the same type of conclusion from the first study, so we found a positive correlation between having paranoid thoughts during the immersive videos and related to having a tendency to paranoia in general, measured with questionnaires, the number of questionnaires. The third aspect, negative automatic thoughts, was a type of state or aspect related to depression. We found a positive correlation between the two, so that people had negative automatic thoughts. Those who had negative automatic thoughts during the immersive videos also had a tendency to have depressive thoughts in everyday life in general. So correlation between state and trait. The same thing, correlation between state and trait between craving for alcohol. So during the immersive video, when individuals who had a craving for alcohol during that, which was correlated with general tendency of alcohol dependence in their life. The only aspect we didn't see a state trait correlation significant was for nicotine craving and nicotine dependence. So people reporting, oh, after 2.5 minutes, I felt a craving for nicotine, and it was not correlated with general nicotine dependence in general treatment. So this last non-result might partly be due to a small subsample. So only of the 150 people, only 31 declared being smokers. So it might be related to the of the participants who were immersed in the video, there were very few smokers. So that might in part explain why there was not a state trait significant correlation between nicotine craving during the immersive video and nicotine dependence. We looked at aspects, again, just because it's a relatively new technology. Was there a high degree of cyber sickness? The answer is no. There were globally low levels of cyber sickness in participants. And we also looked at this degree of sense of presence, as we did in the very first study I presented today. There were moderate levels of presence for all these dimensions. So as I mentioned, we're a bit more sophisticated, looking at 4 different types of sense of presence. In this third study, whereas the first study we looked at one aspect, and we did indeed find that there was a high level of sense of presence during the immersive video. So the conclusion to this third study is that indeed 360-degree immersive videos is a valid method to elicit various psychological symptoms in the same video. So the first study again was a video looking only at paranoid ideation. We compared 3 videos, if you recall. In this final study, we only created one immersive video to look at does this elicit state aspects related to paranoia, to nicotine dependency, to alcohol dependency, to depression, to social anxiety. The answer is yes. This type of video can elicit those types of symptoms in non-clinical participants. We found a relationship between reactions, so the state aspect, during the immersive videos, and various general tendencies trait, as I mentioned, for fear of negative evaluation, carrying thoughts, negative thoughts, craving for alcohol, but not for craving for nicotine. And in the future, which can be done with these immersive videos is we can develop immersive videos specifically designed for these specific tendencies or states, as we did in the first one. For example, developing specific immersive videos for social anxiety, for depression, for nicotine craving, and develop immersive videos for other tendencies or other types of states. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Frank. Se alguém tem alguma pergunta, we are open for questions. Se alguém tem alguma coisa para perguntar, Matheus, você não pergunta antes de... Quer fazer a pergunta? Quem vai fazer? Aí, Matheus, pergunta em inglês para ele e eu posso traduzir.
Acho que ali.
It might be a silly question, but it is out of curiosity. So, have you identified a participant that was like really undergoing psychotic crisis, a proper psychotic crisis, or something close to that?
Good question. We made sure this is a very first study, so all non-clinical participants, all 3 studies, to make sure that they have no previous such as information.
But you did identify some traits, right? Some paranoid traits. And did you find that any of those results were like indicatives of some sort of symptom, weird symptom, or psychosis, something like that?
We made sure that there was a low level of screening. So we screened participants before they made sure that low levels of this. If you recall, there was the first study was very skewed. So there were actually very few people that had paranoid allegations in the first study. So there was a few participants who had relatively high, but there was no psychosis and no pre-psychosis. The vast majority did not have allegations during the studies.
But do you have any interest in replicating with some clinical group or something like that? Patients with psychosis?
I think it can be done, and many things can be done with this technology, essentially, looking at the effects of substances. We stay in the long-term, more or less for ethical reasons as well. What effect does the substance have on radiation? Does certain dose of nicotine or cannabis or caffeine increase brain radiation in certain people? You can also, I suppose, at the other spectrum, include patients. Just be very careful in terms of the design of how you do this. You might elicit paranoid radiation during the surveillance. But you can also do something in between the two, which is using it as perhaps a sort of early detection type of thing. That's the whole idea. When we went for a study, it was very skewed. So it was a very small minority of participants who had paranoid ideations during the surveillance, even though they were just watching something neutral for 3 minutes. You could also use that as a sort of early detection measure. Yeah, so you could find people with validated measures of relatively high early detection level, put them in the video and see how they react to the video. So you can do all levels, and all of them have advantages and disadvantages. Probably the one extremely including patients, it's quite delicate in terms of ethical aspects. But indeed, that's the whole idea, is to say, what is this paranoid scheme of people in the population? Who are these people? Are they at high risk for developing something like this in the future? And it could be also done with nicotine craving, negative thoughts related to depression, or negative, evaluated negative which relates to social anxiety. So you can detect these things quite well in people who are not information. So it's definitely possible.
Ele disse, obrigado pelo evento, boa noite e até amanhã. Vou resumir o que ele falou. Eu perguntei se ele identificou, em algum desses seus estudos, algum paciente que estava em um surto psicótico ou que estava perto disso. Mas aí ele disse que os 3 estudos foram feitos com população clínica, né, pessoa do controle, e aí foi feito um rastreio antes, e aqueles que apresentavam algum nível fora do normal, de algum sintoma psicótico, alguma coisa assim, foram excluídos da pesquisa porque realmente ele queria ver na população do controle. Mas que é uma possibilidade de fazer isso. Primeiro eles queriam ver como é que a população normal se comporta. E aí, inicialmente comparando com pessoas com o uso de algumas drogas, né, como álcool, nicotina. Então é isso. Boa noite, obrigado. Até amanhã.
Mais alguma pergunta? Matheus, quer expulsar todo mundo? Aqui, Claudinha. Você vai ver aqui no chat online.
Thank you very much, Frank. Oh, okay.
Quem é que quer fazer pergunta? Não, vem pra cá, por favor, porque senão o pessoal do online vai perder.
Eu foco no frente. Eu não consigo.
I'm Eloisa. I'm a student of psychology in the last year of graduation. And I'm majorly studied in the psychoanalysis, but I was questioning a lot if you consider the history of the person, the non-clinical patients. So the way that they were raised, their families, their family condition, economic condition, social condition, if you consider this during the study.
We didn't consider that. We have any ideas how that could affect? Because it's a good question. We do a qualitative study. We did something very simple, just validating this for the first time to make sure it made sense. We can do a very sort of qualitative methodology where not just selecting clinical that should have the same age, but looking at various backgrounds. We have some ideas not sort of radiation and aspects we can choose. Because it's simple ideas. Taking people not only that when they're exposed to this for 3 minutes, they have higher radiation. There are other factors as well, such as attachment, increase radiation, or other aspects. Just some ideas, suggestions.
Not any suggestions. I would just consider maybe the opportunity to do it some other time, because it's something that with what I've seen, I'm also like internship in clinical. So I have a couple of patients. I always also do the organization field also there. So I was just thinking about maybe the possibility and yeah, maybe the relationship behind that, and yeah, that's it.
That's definitely the idea. That's an to Mateus. The idea was to create these videos and you can test the effects of substances. Does it before and after increase fear of negative relation, paranoid thoughts, etc. You can also do another video that we could say, I have no idea, so attachment, I'm just going to invite people with certain attachment style, a little profile, put them in immersive video, and compare them with those without that type of style, really just inventing things, and see does that, being immersed in this, does that create more relation, or even something like fear of negative evaluation, or something from the background, that they create the scheme. So the hypothesis was that this being in the lift, for example, which was a very good video, it might have activated some sort of paranoid scheme that they've developed from childhood and adolescence, and they were about 18 to 20 years old. So you could develop something, okay, what's behind this scheme of fear of negative evaluation? I have no idea about this research. That's something you can do, and then you can invite, so you can target populations much more open. But the next step is to target populations who test when they're immersed in this 3D, whatever reactions are in this 3 minutes. So it really, there are loads of opportunities. It's very cheap. You just put a camera and put it in the middle, put it here, with the camera right there. And if there's some people who have fear of giving speeches or social anxiety, you put in this sort of go. Something like you mentioned as well. You're exposed to that situation. You can invite different people. And you can also do other ways. You can also create videos where you ask the actors to react in a certain way. You get in a place of application. You can tell the actors to do something that will elicit some types of reactions.
Então, eu perguntei mais ou menos se eles levaram em consideração a questão mais relacional, então, o histórico familiar, por exemplo. Se eles levaram em consideração o jeito que a pessoa foi criada, como foi criada, sociodemográfico, condição econômica, tudo esse tipo de coisa. Ele falou que não, que isso foi mais um estudo mais fechado. Então, para pessoas tentar entender as tendências mais paranoicas de pessoas que não foram diagnosticadas com tipo de transtorno. Mas eles não levaram em consideração essa parte de pesquisa aí que poderia ser levado para futuras... poderia ser qualificada para futuras pesquisas.
Não, só complementando, que ele falou que não levou isso em consideração, porque primeiro ele queria aplicar isso numa ideia legal para ver se a ideia fazia sentido. E aí, se fizesse, ele poderia refinar, né, aplicando em outras populações, considerando outras variáveis. Essa é a ideia mesmo, validar.
Mais alguém tem alguma pergunta? Antes de a gente encerrar?
Bem, pessoal, cadê aqui no YouTube? Não, tá ok o filme. É só aqui o vídeo. Mas vai tá trazendo o vídeo, chega aqui. Eu tô na grinta. Quando eu olhei, falei, já tá? Então, gente, terminamos o dia de hoje. Foi um dia desafiador, não foi? Todas essas chuvas e essas complicações. A universidade suspendeu as aulas hoje, né? Devido às fortes chuvas na região metropolitana aqui do Recife. Tivemos que fazer uma exposição, né, online. Tentamos pelo YouTube, depois fomos para o Instagram do LabVis e conseguimos chegar no YouTube, o link, mas foi bem desafiador assim, o dia de hoje, devido aos acontecimentos, né, meteorológicos. Amanhã a gente vai continuar com a transmissão via YouTube. Então, quem está assistindo via YouTube, a gente pede que fique atento ao e-mail, que provavelmente vai receber o link de acesso. Mas para quem puder vir para cá, para o auditório, a gente convida que venha para cá. As palestras amanhã são basicamente todas presenciais aqui no auditório. Tem 2 pessoas que estão fora do estado, estão fora do estado, e vão fazer completamente remota para quem está aqui, para quem está assistindo pelo YouTube. E vamos ver o que a gente pode organizar aqui para que a transmissão amanhã seja melhor, né? Eu acho que a gente amanhã consegue fazer, né, algo mais, com menos, né, com menos aperreio, né, gente? Então, para quem veio aqui presencialmente, né, muito obrigada por ter vindo, porque eu sei que foi difícil chegar, né, dessas chuvas. Amanhã a universidade provavelmente vai estar aberta, né? Enfim, vamos ver como é que... Não, amanhã com chuva ou sem chuva, estaremos aqui. Quem conseguir chegar, né? Mas eu acho que amanhã é possível vestir um pouco agora essa madrugada, certo? Eu peço que olhem a programação do site, né? Amanhã seguir a programação certinho. Todas as palestras de amanhã serão em português, com palestrantes brasileiros, né? Que trabalham com esquizofrenia e de bases epistemológicas diversas. A gente vai ter de falas também, né? Seguindo dessa forma. Eu acho que por hoje é isso, né? Só muito obrigada para quem conseguiu vir. Espero vocês amanhã de novo. Estaremos aqui, tá bom? Para quem está